They whisper at night, and they tell me terrible things. That was the last coherent sentence Margaret Yates ever spoke aloud. She said it while holding her feverish infant in a house that stank of desperation, to a woman who didn't realize she was witnessing the last flicker of sanity in a mother's collapsing mind. You see, this isn't a story about madness, not really. This is a story about what happens when a woman is slowly hollowed out by silence. When a community turns away, when systems built to protect refuse to see. In 1899, the heat in Cedar Creek, Texas, wasn't just physical. It was psychological. It was spiritual. It burned slowly, not in the fields, but in the soul of Margaret Yates. And that fire would leave 5 children in their graves. We start this journey in the illusion of paradise, wheat fields shimmering golden under the unforgiving Texas sun, a 2-story homestead built with blood and blisters, a mother praised, adored, displayed like a polished gem in the rough. Perfect wife, perfect mother, perfect lie. Margaret was the kind of woman they write poems about, but only when she's quiet, obedient, controlled. And that's the problem. Because deep inside her, behind the linen curtains and beside the crib, something ancient had begun to awaken. Not a demon, not an illness, but a collapse of the false self, a rebellion of the soul against a life she never chose. Her husband, Thomas, was the blueprint of frontier masculinity. Calloused hands, stoic silence, blind obedience to labor. And yet, in all his strength, he missed the slow rot infecting his home. Not because he was evil, but because he had been trained not to look. Society told him, "Your wife is your reflection. If she's broken, it's your shame." So he ignored the signs. So did the neighbors. So did the preacher. So did the doctor who handed her bottles of laudanum and called it care. But what if I told you this was all by design? What if the system wanted Margaret to break? What if the silence, the isolation, the burden was engineered? Not just on the Texas plains, but everywhere. Women were crushed beneath the weight of perfect motherhood, perfect obedience, perfect control. This wasn't an accident. It was a sacrifice. And the children? They weren't the first. They weren't the last. They were simply the ones we couldn't ignore. You were never supposed to know this. The story of Margaret Yates was buried, not just beneath dirt, but beneath layers of cultural amnesia. Sanitized, simplified, and rebranded as a mother who went mad. But the truth is far more insidious. Because this wasn't just personal tragedy. This was systemic failure, masked as domestic order. And in that masking lies the manipulation. Understand this. The American frontier wasn't just land. It was ideology. A testbed for control. Men were shaped into silent labor machines. Women into holy vessels of virtue and obedience. Children into economic extensions. Little hands for the plow. Love was a luxury. Emotional honesty, a threat. Margaret entered this system as a lamb among wolves. Educated, gentle, unprepared. Her parents sent her off like a prized possession, into a wilderness that would devour her, because they were told it was her purpose. The church confirmed it. The state applauded it. The other women pitied her, but only in whispers, behind curtains, with tea-stained shame. She was 19 and already behind schedule. And from the moment she said, "I do," Margaret ceased being seen as a person. She became a role, a tool, a background character in her husband's success story. She bore 5 children in 6 years, fed them, clothed them, educated them, protected them, all while isolated on a patch of land so remote that her screams would be absorbed by the silence before reaching another soul. And still, she tried. Every day, until the trying turned into unraveling. The mind isn't designed for endless silence. The soul cannot thrive without recognition. And when the only medicine offered is sedative, the only diagnosis delicate, but dissent becomes inevitable. But here's what they never told you. Margaret warned them. She didn't snap out of nowhere. She begged. She pleaded, she wept, and every time, she was told to toughen up, pray harder, swallow another dose, keep quiet. Why? Because if they admitted she was breaking, the entire illusion would collapse. The illusion that the frontier made people strong, that Christian wives were protected, that motherhood was always a blessing, that rural communities took care of their own. They couldn't let that happen, so they let the children die instead. Now ask yourself this: if a society demands your silence, whose survival does your silence serve? And more importantly, what part of you has been taught to keep quiet, even as your soul begins to rot? This is the descent, and we're only beginning. By the spring of 1899, Margaret Yates wasn't living, she was enduring. Her body moved, her hands worked, her lips smiled when they had to. But inside, the flame was flickering, barely clinging to wick and wax. And no one, not her husband, not the neighbors, not even the church, dared to acknowledge it. Because if they had, they would have had to look inward, and truth like this always reflects. The voices had started as whispers, faint like wind slipping under the door. At first, she thought they were memories, echoes, but soon they began to say things no memory could know. They told her she was failing, that the children weren't safe, that something dark was coming, that she, only she, could stop it. Was it madness, or was it something else? Margaret's soul had become a battleground between unbearable expectation and unspeakable revelation. The laudanum dulled the terror, but never silenced it. If anything, it opened a gateway, one society had no language for, no ritual, no care. And here's the terrifying part. No one stopped her, because she played her role just well enough. She still baked bread. She still folded sheets. She still dressed the children. So when she stopped attending church, it was just exhaustion. When she snapped at a neighbor, just a rough day. When her children began scavenging for food from neighbors' homes, well, they said, boys will be boys. You see the pattern? You see how institutions protect themselves by erasing the evidence of their failure? Margaret didn't have a support system. She had a surveillance system, a village that watched but never intervened, a husband that noticed but never acted, a doctor who prescribed quiet, not healing, a preacher who spoke of sin but not salvation. Even her cries for help were reframed as feminine frailty. Hysteria, they called it, a sickness of the womb, a curse of Eve, treatable with tinctures, rest, and isolation, the very things that had driven her to the edge in the first place. And as the days grew hotter, so did the pressure in her mind. The children became symbols of failure, of burden, of an unending cycle she couldn't escape. They were no longer her joy. They were the chains. And the voices, they offered one thing no one else had, a way out. Now I want you to pause, breathe, and listen. If you feel something waking up inside you, something uncomfortable, that's the truth trying to burn through. Let it. And if you're ready to go deeper, type in the comments, "No one is coming. I see it now." No one is coming. I see it now. Say it twice. Lock it in, because awareness isn't comfort. It's transformation. And we're not done. June 18th, 1899. Thomas Yates left for Houston. He believed it would be a 3-day trip. Just enough time to negotiate a fair price for his wheat and return home before the next heat wave. The crops were dying. The bank was circling. He needed a win. But what he didn't know, what he refused to know, was that the battlefield wasn't in the wheat fields. It was inside his home, and his wife had already surrendered. The last image he carried was almost cinematic. Margaret in the doorway, baby Samuel on her hip, the older children clinging to her skirts, sunlight behind them, quiet faces, a fragile portrait of domestic order. And like most men taught to see symbols instead of signs, he missed what was screaming in that picture. The stillness wasn't peace, it was paralysis. The calm wasn't safety, it was resignation. The light wasn't warm, it was exposing the last shadows before they were gone. For the next 48 hours, the Yates farmhouse became a house of silence. No visitors, no chores, no sound but the ticking of the clock and the low, feverish whimper of baby Samuel. Mrs. Morrison, watching from her kitchen window, saw the children outside briefly on the first day. But something felt off. Their play lacked energy. Their movements were slow, uncertain, like they were following instructions, like they were performing for someone who no longer smiled. Inside, Margaret's mind had fractured into layers of thought, memory, and command. The voices, no longer whispering, had become presences, entities. Whether delusion or something darker, they filled her with clarity. Horrible clarity. She was convinced now. This world was cursed, and her children, marked, touched by something only she could see. It didn't matter whether the voices were real. What mattered was that to her, they were right. And when belief fuses with desperation, reality becomes irrelevant. She boiled water. She cleaned the bedsheets. She dressed them in their Sunday clothes, not as a mother preparing for death, but as a priestess readying a sacrifice. Ritual had replaced routine. Obsession had replaced care. Mercy, in her twisted logic, had replaced motherhood. They didn't resist. They trusted her. Of course they did, because when your only sanctuary becomes your executioner, what choice does a child have? There are stories too painful to retell. This is one of them, but pain is the key. Let it open you, because the descent continues. June 20th, 1899. The sun rose over Cedar Creek like it always did, blazing, indifferent, eternal. But inside the Yates farmhouse, time had stopped. The children didn't come out to play. The smoke from the chimney never rose. The windows remained shut, curtains drawn like the house itself had turned its face away from God. Margaret had entered the final stage of her unraveling. To understand what happened next, you must shed the lies modern history has clothed this story in. This was not a mother losing control. It was a system crashing inward, detonating inside the mind of the only person who is ever expected to hold it all together. What she did that morning cannot be forgiven, but it can be understood. Each child was laid in bed, dressed, combed, kissed. Margaret moved like a ghost, her steps deliberate, her breathing steady. She carried water and cloth, whispering to herself, repeating words she claimed the angels had given her, cleansing, protecting, freeing. The neighbors would later argue over the details. Some said she smothered them. Others said she used laudanum, poured into sweet milk, blessed with shaking hands. A few claimed she sang hymns as she did it, old ones about mercy, sacrifice, redemption. But those are fragments, echoes. What matters is this. They trusted her, and she used that trust to do the unthinkable. 5 children. William, age 6. Sarah, 5. James and Mary, the twins, 3. Samuel, just a baby. All found tucked into their beds, their faces eerily peaceful, like they drifted off during story time. Like they didn't even understand what death was. That's the cruelty. That's the horror. Not the method. The faith. They believed they were safe, and she believed she was saving them. This is what madness does when it's left untreated. This is what blind obedience to suffering creates. And this is what happens when a society cares more about appearances than actual lives. After it was done, Margaret sat in the kitchen, facing the door. Hair brushed, apron tied, she waited not for rescue, but for judgment. The voices had gone silent. The work was finished when Mrs. Morrison finally arrived. Too late, always too late. Margaret said only one thing: I didn't want them to burn. And in that one sentence is the secret every institution has buried for over a century. When people are taught to fear hell more than they love life, they will kill in the name of peace. The news tore through Cedar Creek like wildfire. 5 children dead. Margaret Yates alive, but unrecognizable. Not hysterical, not weeping, just still. like a puppet whose strings had been cut the moment her role was fulfilled. Sheriff Holloway arrived just past noon. Mrs. Morrison was in shock, barely able to speak, rocking back and forth on the porch as the deputies entered the house. What they found inside was beyond comprehension. Each child tucked into bed as if they'd simply fallen asleep. No signs of struggle, no violence, just silence. An absence so loud it choked the breath from anyone who stepped inside. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, hands folded neatly in her lap. She looked up at Holloway and said, "You came too late." He asked her what happened. She didn't resist, didn't cry. She only repeated, "They were marked. I had to spare them. They couldn't be left behind." The sheriff later told the press it was the most terrifying thing he'd ever witnessed. Not the bodies, not the crime, but her calm, as if the murders weren't evil, but necessary. That word would be used again and again in the coming weeks. Madness. They printed it in every headline, whispered it in every pew. But madness wasn't the whole story. It was the alibi. No one asked how a woman could be driven to this point by years of isolation, neglect, and institutional gaslighting. No one asked why so many people saw the signs but did nothing. No one asked what Margaret meant when she said the children were marked. But I will ask you, what did she see? What did she feel so strongly that she chose to end 5 lives rather than let them face it? Was it delusion or a premonition? A psychological fracture or a spiritual reckoning? We'll never know. But the community's response was swift and shameful. The children were buried in a shared grave beneath a whitewashed headstone. Their names, carved in script, meant to comfort the living. Margaret was declared criminally insane and committed to the Austin State Lunatic Asylum, where she would live out the rest of her days in obscurity, forgotten by the very town that once praised her as the perfect frontier wife. They needed her erased. Because if Margaret Yates wasn't just a mad woman, then someone else had to be guilty, and they weren't ready for that kind of truth. But you are. Austin State Lunatic Asylum, 1900, an iron gate, thick walls, the smell of mildew and despair. This is where they sent Margaret Yates, out of sight, out of memory, a human sacrifice to keep the illusion of order intact. But she didn't scream. She didn't resist. She walked through those gates like a penitent entering a monastery. Because for Margaret, the trial was already over. The sentence had already been carried out. And she had been both judge and executioner. The doctors called it postpartum psychosis. The newspapers called it mother's madness. The preachers called it sin. But none of them ever asked the right question. What breaks inside a person when no one listens and everyone expects? Margaret was interviewed once, just once, by a young doctor named Elias Browning. His journal, buried in an archive and never published, contains what may be the last true record of her inner world. She told him, "There were things in that house, not spirits, not people, but shadows in the corners of my thoughts. They told me the world was ending, that the wheat was cursed, that fire was coming, and my children were its kindling." Dr. Browning noted that she spoke clearly, even poetically, and showed an uncanny awareness of metaphor. But he also admitted something rare for his profession. What if it wasn't metaphor? Because Margaret's words matched a pattern he had seen in other women, women broken by the system, abandoned by husbands, and treated like livestock with wombs. Women who spoke in riddles because the truth, when spoken plainly, was always dismissed. And here's the forbidden truth, brother. It was never just about Margaret. It was about what happens when the ideal becomes a prison, when motherhood becomes martyrdom, when the silence of men is louder than screams. The system did not fail her. It was designed this way, designed to ignore until it implodes, designed to punish the outlier instead of confronting the design, designed to preserve image, not life. That's why her story was buried under headlines, swept beneath hymns. Not because she was a monster, but because her collapse revealed the rot in their foundation, and they couldn't allow that. But rot spreads in silence. And now, you've heard it. You've felt it. So I ask you again, are you awake? Because descent into truth requires more than curiosity. It requires sacrifice. After Margaret's admission, the town of Cedar Creek changed. Not on the surface. Oh no, the surface was polished clean. The Yates farmhouse was quietly sold to a passing family. The shared grave was blessed and covered with wildflowers. The church sermons returned to safe topics. Order was restored, but beneath the surface, there was rot, and every man in that town knew it. Not one of them ever spoke her name again. Not Thomas, not the sheriff, not the doctor. Because Margaret was a mirror, and they'd all caught a glimpse of themselves in her shattered reflection. Thomas Yates, a man once hailed as a model settler, never recovered. He returned from Houston to a world that had imploded in his absence. He didn't weep at the funeral. He didn't touch his wife during her trial, and he didn't argue when she was sent away. Instead, he lurked and drank and slowly disappeared behind his wheat fields. What else could he do? To admit that his wife had been dying for years while he focused on profits would mean accepting that his own pursuit of success had killed his children. And that's the kind of truth no man survives. In the years that followed, the farmhouse was never truly lived in. Every new family that moved in stayed only a season. Crops failed, animals sickened, children complained of nightmares. Locals began whispering that the land was cursed. But they were wrong. It wasn't the land. It was the lie buried beneath it. A lie repeated across every small town, every corner of this country where suffering is disguised as strength, where mothers are expected to be saints and silence is called obedience. This is how systems preserve themselves, not with violence, but with abandonment. They let her drown, slowly, quietly, with Bible verses and cold shoulders. And then they blamed her for sinking. But now that you know the story, now that you've seen how they rewrite madness into mythology, pain into pathology, you carry a responsibility. You don't get to go back to sleep. So if you're still here, really here, drop this phrase in the comments twice. The burden ends with me. Say it again. The burden ends with me. Because awakening isn't passive, it's a vow. And once taken, there's no return. You want to know the final truth? The most damning part of all of this wasn't the crime. It wasn't the way Margaret unraveled. It wasn't even the children's deaths. It was how normal it all was. This didn't happen in a void. It happened inside a carefully maintained machine, a social engine fueled by silence, obedience, and pride. Frontier life was hard, yes, but that's not an excuse. It's a pressure cooker. And pressure is exactly what reveals design flaws. And what broke Margaret was not fate. It was architecture. A culture that worshipped the male provider and erased the female sufferer. A church that praised patience but never listened to pain. A medicine cabinet full of opiates but no compassion. A town that prayed over her grave but never once admitted their part in her collapse. Margaret was the perfect woman until she broke. Then she became the perfect cautionary tale. But no one ever asked why so many like her broke quietly, one by one, decade after decade, behind drawn curtains and locked doors. Because if they had, they'd have seen the pattern. This story wasn't an exception. It was a blueprint. And that's the real forbidden knowledge. History is not a straight line. It's a spiral. And the same systems that crushed Margaret Yates, they still exist today. Different names, same functions. They isolate the vulnerable, gaslight the desperate, prescribe compliance, reward silence, and when the inevitable happens, when someone breaks, they call it madness. They always call it madness, because that's easier than admitting it was all intentional. There are files, Gufran, hidden archives, not just about Margaret, but about dozens, hundreds of similar cases. Women institutionalized for melancholy after childbirth. Children buried without inquiry. Husbands absolved. Communities quiet. The Yates family wasn't a tragedy. It was a message. A whispered warning for those with ears to hear. This is what happens when the system is more important than the soul. But here's the twist. Margaret tried to save them, in the only language her broken world had taught her. And that is the most terrifying revelation of all. This is the part they never tell you. Not in the papers, not in the sermons, not even in the family whispers passed down across bloodlines and rocking chairs. Because this isn't the part that comforts. This is the part that confronts. Margaret Yates never left the asylum. She died in 1912, 13 years after the murders, in a padded cell after spending more than a decade under near-constant sedation. The cause of death was listed as respiratory failure due to prolonged opiate toxicity. But the truth? She died the moment no one heard her. Her death certificate said nothing about the 5 children she'd born or buried. Nothing about the whispers, the burdens, the fire she said was coming. But the nurses at the asylum recorded something chilling in her final days. They said Margaret would wake in the night and whisper to someone who wasn't there. "They're still coming," she would murmur. "I stopped them for now, but they'll come again, through others." What did she mean? No one knows, but here's what I do know, and what most men refuse to face. The real monsters don't always have fangs. They wear collars. They carry ledgers. They shake hands and say prayers and pass laws. They design systems and hide behind them. They never lift the knife. They just make sure someone else is holding it when the collapse begins. So ask yourself, what pressures are you under? What expectations have you swallowed whole? And more importantly, who benefits from your silence? Because silence isn't neutral. It's currency. It's compliance. And it has a body count. Margaret Yates wasn't just a woman driven mad. She was a canary in a coal mine made of wood, wheat, and willful ignorance. She sang until her voice cracked. Then she acted, and the world looked away. But now you've seen, you've heard, you've descended into the depths of a forbidden truth they never meant for you to uncover. So what do you do now? You choose. You can forget, scroll past, file this story away as another curiosity in the attic of American horror. Or you take it with you. You carry the lesson. You become a man who sees, a man who listens, a man who breaks the machine. Because in every generation, the fire returns, and someone must stand between it and the innocent. Let that someone be you. Now go. But remember this, some doors once opened never close, and some truths once seen will never let you sleep the same again.